Welcome, everybody, to the second of 4 Shulman lectures this spring on the topic of other minds. For those that don't know, I am Lori Santos from the Department of Psychology, and I am one half of the duo that is teaching the Shulman lecture class this year, along with Henry Coles, who is from the program in History of Science and Medicine. We are convening these lectures, as some of you may know from last time, in conjunction with a course by the same topic name, a course called Other Minds. And so in this room right now are the 20 or so undergraduates who are taking this course as well. The Shulman lectures that accompany the course are presented under the auspices of the Franke program in the Sciences and Humanities. And this is made possible by the generosity of Richard and Barbara Franke. So let's thank them for a second, if you wouldn't mind. The series itself is named after Robert Shulman, Sterling Professor Emeritus of Chemistry, Molecular Biophysics, and Biochemistry, and also Senior Research Scientist in Diagnostic Radiology. And that is in recognition of his roles as a founding fellow of the Whitney and his unwavering supporter his unwavering support and help in integrating the sciences and the humanities at Yale. And so we're super thankful not just to have the opportunity to give this lecture series, but also the opportunity to do it in honor of Robert Shulman. This lecture is the second of 4 lectures that we have, and just a quick reminder that we have 2 more coming up. Both are going to be after spring break. The first of those is going to be on April 5th, and that's from Mark Moffett, aka Dr. Bugs, who's going to give us a talk on social identity in ants, questioning whether or not ants have the same kind of intergroup conflict as we do in human warfare, so that should be a fun one.
And answering yes.
And he's going to answer yes, so if you disagree with him, it'll be even more fun, I think. The final lecture is going to be April 26th, and that's going to be by Anne Harrington from Harvard on the history of meditation in the United States. She's going to be taking the interesting argument that meditation allows us to think of our own minds as another mind, and it allows us to know ourselves better by treating ourselves as an other. So that one should also be fun. But we hope to see everyone who is in this room for this talk there for those other Shulman lectures. Now I will let Henry come and introduce our current speaker.
So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our second Shulman lecturer of the year, Peter Godfrey-Smith. I was just reminding him that I had seen him before when I surreptitiously audited about half a class that he taught 13 years ago at Harvard. I sat in the back row and never said anything. There was one other auditor in the course who was noted biologist Richard Lewontin, who sat in the front row and said something all the time. And so it was a kind of, there were 2 auditors, that's all I'll say. Peter Godfrey-Smith is professor of the history and philosophy of science at the University of Sydney and also professor of philosophy at the CUNY Grad Center. He's a world-renowned philosopher who specializes in the philosophy of science and in particular the philosophy of biology, but also the philosophy of mind. His books include Complexity and the Function of Mind and Nature, Theory and Reality, An Introduction to the Philosophy of Science, actually the first book I ever read in philosophy of science, Darwinian Populations and Natural Selection, which won the 2010 Lakatos Award, and Philosophy of Biology. This work at the intersection of philosophy of biology and philosophy of mind made Professor Godfrey-Smith an obvious choice for us when Lori and I were putting together the list for lecturers, and we were really happy that he agreed to come. Our course, as you know from last time, sits right at the boundary between biology and psychology in certain ways, so he seemed perfect. But we didn't, at the time, realize how perfect until I sent him the email over the summer, and he wrote back, and here I quote, "In a zeitgeistish coincidence," I'm not sure if that's a word, I'll also be doing some work in the spring to promote a book called Other Minds. It's mostly about the cephalopods, as you might guess. It won't be a problem coming up with something to talk about. And indeed, Other Minds, the Octopus, the Sea, and the Deep Origins of Consciousness appeared this past December. It's a beautiful book on topics that are absolutely central to the themes of this course and to conversations that are going on around campus here at Yale. I'm sure we'll hear more about it from Professor Godfrey-Smith today. Please join me in welcoming him to Yale.
Thanks very much. Okay, here's an animal, an octopus, moving under jet propulsion. That's a video screenshot. And here's another animal, a bear, a black bear in the Sierras. So these are both large, complex animals. Do they have subjective experience? Is there something it's like, something it feels like to be each of these animals? I think so. Certainly they behave as if they do, but what does it even mean to ask that question? How can we answer the question in a way that involves something more than just personal impressions. I'll talk about those topics a bit later, but another theme here is the fact that if both of them do, octopus and bear, if they both have subjective experience, then this fact has importance given their evolutionary relationships. This would help us establish some facts about the historical pattern that are intrinsically interesting, and that line of thought might also lead to some possible morals about what subjective experience is, what kind of thing it is. Okay, firstly, some setup. So what are we trying to explain? Well, I used the phrase subjective experience. Other people in the same general area talk about consciousness or phenomenal consciousness as a sort of particular kind of consciousness as what's to be explained. The term qualia is also used by philosophers, and to some extent these are different terminologies aiming at the same thing. For example, with a lot of those sort of more jargony terms, if you press the person and say, okay, what do you mean by that? They'll say, well, I'm talking about the fact that for some systems in the world, there's something it feels like to be that thing. So that's Thomas Nagel's phrasing. And a lot of people who use different terminology, their second step is to sort of draw on that Nagel phrase. And I think also that that is a pretty reasonable way of setting things up. I think that talking of this as the question of consciousness is not the best, it's not the best terminology at least, even if you qualify it and say you're talking about a particular kind of consciousness, partly because it just suggests that there's too much in the picture. So suppose we could give a theory of which animals have sort of washes of feeling, such as pains. You might say that's a theory of which animals are conscious, but it always sounds a bit awkward to me. Regardless of terminology, I think the broad eventual shape that a theory will have in this area will recognize a kind of broad notion that you might also refer to as sentience, in which basic sorts of feelings are sufficient for that, and there'll be some narrower category, or perhaps a couple of narrower categories that amount to consciousness. And here I'm going to be mostly concerned with the broader category, not entirely though. I'll look at the possibility that some of what one might initially think of as features of consciousness in a richer sense might be parts of the story very early on. So the sort of mix of old and new, or the mix of basic and derived features might not map in a simple way onto what you might think of as a kind of informal, pre-theoretic distinction between feeling as a broad category and consciousness as a narrower category. The way I approach all these questions, more specifically, is through the idea of a subject. So the phrase subjective experience suggests that subjects should be on the table, and I think this is the right way in. I think this is a way into the problem that is not overly encumbered with other unwelcome stuff. So what counts as a sort of a piece of unwelcome encumbering? Well, the idea of qualia I think of as an often unhelpful term. So the term is often explained by saying, well, the qualia, these are the raw feels of experience. And that's okay if what you mean is that for some of the things that go on in you, there's a way it feels like to have them going on, and the word qualia refers to the ways they feel. I think that's okay. But when people talk about qualia as real features of the world, what they often have in mind is a picture in which sensations are things that, an agent, such as a person, is in a kind of quasi-perceptual or perception-like relationship to. And those things, sensations, have these qualities referred to as qualia. And I think if you think that way, then nothing but trouble will result. So I steer as far as possible away from that kind of sense data or strongly sensation-based picture of the situation. I think the right way to think about all of these topics is to think, right, there are these things, subjects, which are a special kind of thing in the world, and one thing we want to understand is how it's possible for it to feel like something to be one of these things. and we want to understand which systems are such that it feels like something to be those systems. So that's the broad setting up. Now, in this particular talk, I want to focus on a couple of questions which are both intrinsically interesting and I think feed into these giant philosophical topics. Here's one question. Was there a single path evolutionarily through which subjective experience arose, or was there more than one path? So was there a single origin followed by radiation down various lines, or were there several independent origins? And if there were multiple paths, was this a matter of a single type of path and several instances of that path? So the same kind of thing happened several times, or was there more than one type? So that's the first cluster of questions, one origin versus several. A second question is related. Did subjective experience arise in a fully gradual way, or was there more of a kind of jump or a threshold effect? So in philosophy, people often talk about consciousness or phenomenal consciousness as something which is either present or absent, and a system is either either lacks or has consciousness. There's either something it's like to be that creature or there's not. But this may be a matter of degree, and that possibility runs a bit against our habits of talk, but it might be something that we have to get used to. Now, the questions of gradualism and the question of number of paths interact. In particular, the greater the role for gradual change, the deeper in time the evolution of consciousness probably goes. So the further back in time a kind of non-zero value probably goes, and hence there's a greater likelihood of one origin and subsequent radiation. Now, all these questions about number of paths, about gradualness, would have relatively simple answers if only humans, or perhaps only primates, had subjective experience or phenomenal consciousness. Then there would probably be a single origin and radiation just down a couple of evolutionary lines. Now, I assume that that restriction with respect to this trait is unlikely. I won't defend that specifically much here. I'll just sort of assume we're being open to the possibility that it's far more widespread. And other background assumptions I'll make in this talk include materialism and the assumption that a great many things in the world have not even a scrap of subjective experience at all, sort of rocks and tables and things like that. Okay, the next part of the talk will have a sketch of animal evolution, and then I'll look for contact with these questions about the origin of subjective experience. Okay, so life in general forms the rough shape of a tree, or life on Earth anyway. So from a single origin, a series of branching events gave rise to the different kinds of life present at later times. Now, that tree model doesn't fit all kinds of life well. Bacteria, in particular, form a network with a different shape, and a lot of the early stages are less tree-like. But the part of the tree that includes animals is pretty tree-like, so I'll sort of just talk about tree shapes in the tree of life without worrying too much about exceptions. Any two organisms alive now have various common ancestors because the tree has a single origin, and in particular they have a most recent common ancestor, the last animal in time for which that animal's part of the history of both. Now, in all of these tree diagrams, time is going to be running up the screen. So, the past is here, the present or the later times are at the top. So that sort of puts the animal part of the tree of life in a very simple form with just a couple of examples, and situates it in relation to our closest non-animal relatives, choanoflagellates, which are single-celled and colonial organisms that are outside the animals. So sponges are, there's the animal branch. Sponges are animals. Cnidarians include creatures like jellyfish and corals, and bilaterian animals include nearly all the ones you're familiar with. So us, ants, bees, octopuses, all the ones that have a left-right, a distinction that can be drawn between left and right, as well as a distinction between top and bottom. I'll talk more about that kind of body plan shortly. So if we zoom in on the right-hand side of that figure, here's a whole bunch of familiar animals arranged in their tree-like relationships. So we're over on the far right. We're vertebrates. Interestingly, echinoderms such as starfish are more closely related to us than a lot of other invertebrate animals. And there we have a whole bunch of animals which are not vertebrates with their various relationships. So as before, cnidarians, the jellyfish and the corals and so on, are off there on the left. And you have a couple of deep branchings there, where one particular branching here leads to protostomes and deuterostomes, sort of our line. And most of the familiar invertebrate animals are in this protostome branch, including insects and other arthropods like crabs, including octopuses and other mollusks such as oysters, earthworms, and various others. Now, a couple of important early stages, and one particular invention I'll focus on at various points. So here we have, marked by a star, I've marked the bilaterian LCA, the last common ancestor. So this is the animal that is the last animal who is an ancestor of all of the protostomes and all of the deuterostomes, animals like insects, animals like octopuses, and animals like you. And in a moment I'll talk about what this, do that next? Yeah, I'll do that more or less next. And another invention, another step I'll talk about in some detail is the invention of the nervous system. Now, everything pictured in this chart, not everything pictured in the previous chart, has a nervous system. So nervous systems came in quite early in the history of animal life. Now, this animal, the bilaterian last common ancestor, what did it look like? It probably looked like a little worm, a flattened worm more specifically. No one really knows. There's no fossil record of this organism. It had a nervous system for sure, or almost certainly, and it lived a long time ago, perhaps 600 million years or so ago. Now this is the last common ancestor of the octopus and the bear, the two animals that I used to open my talk. Now at the top there I have just a very sort of sketchy, there's a flattened worm with a couple of relevant features marked. There is a left and right. It's got that sort of left and right organised body plan. It probably had very simple eyes, or at least it's quite likely that this animal had very simple eyes, much, much smaller than the ones I've drawn there for emphasis. And here below we have two fleshed out reconstructions, a kind of simple and a complex hypothesis with respect to what the last bilaterian common ancestor might have looked like. So here's a sort of worm-like thing, a bit like my drawing. And there's the possibility that some people entertained that it was somewhat more complicated, with segments, with a brain, a centralized nervous system rather than just a nervous system scattered through the body and so on. People sometimes think that flatworms like this one, so this, I've included the caption here from a Royal Society special issue where they talk about the possibility that very early bilaterian animals might have looked sort of something like a present-day flatworm. Now, present-day flatworms, like that one, are the product of as much evolution as we are. So, far from us does not mean similar to old forms in general, but there's some reason that some people think to entertain the possibility that the last common ancestor of bilaterian animals might have looked something like that. Okay, I am now looking at the fact that my computer might be crashing as we watch. Yep, I have the whirling pizza for no reason that I can explain. So what I may have to do, if you bear with me, is just get out and restart this because the rest of the slides do matter to the talk. So please just bear with me for a second. As I say, I don't know why that's happened. It's not a power problem, I'm sure of that. I'll check that as we go through the restart, but I think it's not that. Okay, this is going to be all right. Okay, no idea why that happened. Let's assume it's not going to happen again. All right, now here's another tree of life diagram where the point now is to put some of these important events into a sort of a more genuinely historical context. So if you ask about what the very first forms of animal life were like, then the answer is, roughly speaking, nobody knows. There's no fossil record of what the very first genuine animal forms might have looked like. The first period in time from which we have fossil evidence of the lives of animals is a period called the Ediacaran period, which was 635 million to about 540 million years ago. So what was life like in the Ediacaran? Well, here is a beautiful reconstruction of Ediacaran life by the English artist John Sibbick. And so a couple of things might jump out at you. One is it's not clear what might be an animal here and what might be a living organism but not an animal. And if that's your impression, then you're not alone. That's something that biologists argue about quite a bit. Another more subtle feature is the following. If you were to look at these guys and even consider the ones that have animals and the ones that probably had nervous systems, because nervous systems probably evolved before this time, then a feature suggested by the painting is the fact that these animals don't seem to have much to do with each other. And they don't feature the sort of biological machinery with which to interact in rich ways with each other. Legs and claws and hard parts, complicated senses such as complex eyes and so on. And if that's your impression, I think that's possibly a good impression. The most undeniably, or at least very likely mobile of the animals known from the Ediacaran was this guy, Kimberella, who was just drawn in a very small form by Sibbick. Looks a little bit like a half macaroon crawling along the sea floor. So at this stage in animal evolution, you have what look like very limited behavioural capacities and a life with sort of limited engagement of one individual with another. But it's also the case that during the Ediacaran, and I'll go back to that tree diagram, so the Ediacaran is that orange band there. Many of the deep branching events occurred that set in place the different lines that then went forward in the history of animal evolution. So a lot of the branches probably occurred at this early time when life was like that. And then life became like this. This is a recent reconstruction of an animal from the Cambrian period, which comes after the Ediacaran. And Cambrian animals look completely different from Ediacaran animals. You have various kinds of hard parts. You have obvious appendages, legs, claws, other kinds of limbs. There's good evidence for the existence of quite complex eyes from this time. And the kind of experience of these animals, if they experienced things, was very different from Ediacaran life. So here's John Sibbick's one of his representations of life in the Cambrian. So it's now the case that animals have a lot to do with each other, in particular in the relations between predators and prey. And more generally, there was a kind of speeding up of action, it's thought, and a kind of heavier degree of involvement of the life of one animal in another at the time. It appears likely that arthropods, the group that includes present-day insects, sort of led the way with respect to this change. And it may have been the case that a feedback process involving more complex behaviour on the part of arthropods set in place a lot of evolution in other groups, and that although there may have been a contribution from changing chemistry in the oceans to the transformations in the Cambrian, a lot of it might have been sort of self-propelled by positive feedback involving new forms of behaviour, new bodies that those behaviours require, and control systems, nervous systems that lie underneath those behaviours. As I said, though, the big divergences had already taken place. So the evolution of that kind of behavioural complexity from the Cambrian onwards was parallel evolution. Animals had already, many of the familiar forms of animals had already begun to go their separate evolutionary ways. And if we go forward very far in time and summarise things very broadly, you get to a picture something like this. So here, the green there is the Cambrian, the orange is the Ediacaran. And among the many things that happened in evolution from the Cambrian onwards is the fact that in a few groups, conspicuously complex behaviours and very complex nervous systems arose, where there's a rough count of 3 times this happened. So vertebrates like us, for example, have large nervous systems and a lot of complex behaviours. Various arthropods, and as I've drawn it there, they kind of began perhaps the process in the early Cambrian. They also have those features, including especially some insects such as bees. And outside of those 2 groups, cephalopods, a particular group of mollusks, acquired quite spectacularly large nervous systems when compared to other invertebrates. So the general picture that we get, actually I'll just add a bit of context to this. So that's a tree diagram that summarises sort of general behavioural evolution. Here's a diagram from a paper by Dan Erik Nielsen, specifically just about the evolution of eyes. So Nielsen distinguishes 4 or sort of roughly 4.5 different kinds of complexity with respect to eye-like structures. There's non-directional photoreception, just tracking light. There's picking up light in a way that gives you some sense of where the light's coming from. There's low-resolution genuine vision and high-resolution vision. And although the sort of groups are now ordered from left to right in a different way from the way I had them, you see that high-resolution vision evolved just 3 times independently from low-resolution vision. There's vertebrates on the left-hand side, there are cephalopods sort of alone among the mollusks, and there are a couple of arthropod groups using eyes of a quite different design. So the general picture we get is a picture in which there was a period of intense behavioural evolution that began after the main lineages had diverged, with 3 groups going down roads of complex sensing and behaviour. Now, this sort of rough count of 3 origins for complex behaviour in animals will be questioned. Firstly, because animals differ so much in their behavioural styles. They show different kinds of complexity. And there are also kind of lumping versus splitting issues. So you might count 1 origin for the vertebrates, or you might insist that mammals and birds, which have quite a deep, historically deep branching point, count as 2 independent origins to complexity in the relevant sense. And within the arthropods, animals like insects, there are also several different groups with complexity of their own, not clustered close together. So behaviourally complex spiders are quite a long distance from behaviourally complex insects such as bees. And similarly, within the cephalopods, octopuses and cuttlefish have a deep branching in time, something like 270 million years ago. So there's lumping versus splitting issues. Still, I think there's some sense in that kind of first count of 3 evolutionary lines producing significant neural and behavioural complexity. Okay, so that's the historical side. And now let's start to try to use the history to probe the evolution of subjective experience itself and chart some possibilities. Well, one possible way of describing or sort of representing the history of subjective experience is essentially just to use the same picture, the one that I used for behavioral and cognitive complexity, or behavioral and neural complexity in general. So a person might say that, look, the right way to think about subjective experience is it's just the cognitive side of the mind from the inside. It's not a particular kind of thing added on to the evolution of complex brains and complex behavior in general. It's just how those things feel to have them from the inside. And we've agreed, this person might say, that there were 3 independent origins for, conspicuous, really high-grade behavioural complexity, and that suggests 3 different origins for subjective experience. And on a view like that, you have one path type. You have one kind of thing that happened, and 3 times it happened. Or, as I say, you might argue about whether 3 is the right count, but something in that ballpark. If you're more exacting about what counts as a behavioural complexity, you might knock out the arthropods and say there's just these 2, the vertebrates and the cephalopods. Now, as I drew it here, we have differences of degree, intensity of shading, and was supposed to represent the idea that there's gradual change in these properties, but we also have a cutoff. And you might wonder about the basis for that cutoff. It seems to be quite impressionistic. Most people don't want to regard bacteria and grass as conscious beings, but if you pick out at the top end a biological property X, that's the one that matters, and then you find that gradations with respect to that property extend down into the past and sideways into very unexpected groups, then it seems you should just accept that you've learnt that you should draw the picture differently and accept a highly gradualist view of the origin of subjective experience. And then you might say that there should be some faint shading extending all through the animal tree perhaps, or all through the bilaterian part of a tree, perhaps all through every part of cellular life. Now, I spend a lot of time these days thinking about how to grapple with views of that kind. In this talk, though, I'm not going to follow that road. Instead, I'm going to follow a different road where we start to do some splitting exercises. So I had a kind of rough count of 3 origins for behavioural complexity and the possibility of 3 origins for subjective experience. But of course, that was a very coarse-grained and somewhat vague way of looking at the situation. So let's probe at that set of relationships more closely, and in particular ask the question, why should we think the same kind of thing happened several different times, given the differences in the lives that animals live? And I'll look at 2 clusters of properties that might have some kind of intimate relationship to the existence of genuine subjective experience, each of which has been used as the basis for a kind of freestanding, single factor, here is the story theory by various people. So in each case, people have said, here is the story about the origin of subjective experience. And in each case, you might say, right, I sign on to that one. I think that is the right story. Or you might say, you need both of these 2 clusters of properties. Or thirdly, you might say, well, either is sufficient. But once you say either is sufficient, it seems that what you're really saying is not that there's one kind of thing, subjective experience, and there are sort of 2 ways of getting to that one thing. It seems that you're thinking perhaps that what we have sort of loosely lumped together as subjective experience really has a kind of duality within it. There are sort of several different kinds, and perhaps in very complex animals like us, it's all in there together, but perhaps in other animals you might have one without the other. So then there would be not just different instances, not just different evolutionary paths in the sense of different instances of the same kind of process, but different kinds of origin for subjective experience. Okay, so let me talk about some of these. I meant to have an octopus photo up there just during that part of the talk, not for any particular reason. Well, actually, let me use that as a segue into, I thought I would show one octopus video in this talk. And the point of this video is to highlight the fact that there's genuine behavioural complexity well outside the vertebrates. And in particular, in the octopus field site that I study in Australia, we conjecture that the unusual densities, the unusual numbers of individuals that have had to live together in this area have led to a kind of sort of semi-social or low-grade social engagement of one individual with another, which is quite different from the usual lives that octopuses live. So what I'm going to show is a video of a kind of agonistic interaction between one octopus and another, which has a lot of chromatic complexity. So this animal has pulled his body very high on the vertical axis there, made himself as dark and as large as possible, and is about to zoom towards another octopus on the left. And as he zooms towards the other one, it doesn't just change into a particular colour, but changes into a particular pair of colours. So if I go back and freeze it at a particular point, you'll see that, I'll try and hit exactly the right point. So there's the aggressor octopus. Bang. So what the chased one has done, it's split its body colouring and patterning in half, exactly down the middle, where on the side facing the chasing octopus, there's a kind of high contrast blotchy pattern. And on the side facing away from the chasing octopus, there's a kind of muted, low contrast camouflage sort of pattern. Now, our conjecture about this case is the following. That kind of high contrast pattern has been discussed in cephalopods before as something that they do when they flee, when confronted with a variety of different predators, such as fish, sharks, and the like. On this particular site, you see this pattern produced specifically at aggressive octopuses when they're fleeing, but you also see it when an animal is trying to just sort of make its way through the site in a way that is in no sense fleeing. It can be a kind of approach, but it appears to be an attempt to signal a kind of non-agonistic or non-aggressive, non-confrontational mode of behaviour. So the conjecture that we have is that this particular high-density site, a pattern of behaviour that in octopuses in general is usually directed as a signal at individuals of other species, is perhaps being pressed into service through individual level adaptation as a within population signal that performs the function of helping them navigate this rather complex game theoretic social environment that they've found themselves in. Okay, that was an octopus interlude. Okay, now trying to think about these more specific features that might bear helpfully on questions about subjectivity. What I'll discuss first is a family of views and one particular member of the family that place a great deal of emphasis on the senses, on perception and perceptual representation, where the idea is that a certain kind of sophistication in handling sensory information is what counts in making a transition between animals with and animals without subjective experience. Now, lots of philosophers would follow a road like this at the moment, and in most forms I don't think of the view as very promising. But this view might have a good form, and my source for this form, for this version of the view, is especially this paper up here by the neuroscientist Bjorn Merker. So here's a sketch of one way in which you might try to work out what makes the difference between some animals and others in this area. So all organisms sense, and all organisms act in consequence. And in general, not absolutely invariably, what you sense depends on what you just did. So it's not just the case that your senses feed your actions, but your actions have consequences for what you sense. Now, for some organisms, ones with particular kinds of senses, that fact introduces ambiguity about the origins of sensory events. There's a question, was what I just perceived a consequence of my own actions, or does it indicate some important change in the world? So that kind of feedback between action and the senses can be a source of ambiguity. It can also be a resource. By acting, you can probe the world and feed your own senses new kinds of information. So around 1950, a couple of neurophysiologists, von Holst and Mittelstadt, introduced a helpful terminology for this phenomenon. So Afference just refers to kind of input. And they said we can distinguish ex-afference from reafference, where ex-afference is sensory input that comes from events in the world outside. And reafference is sensory input that's a causal consequence of what you have just done. And for mobile animals especially, there's a kind of liability that reafference involves because of its constant introduction of ambiguity. Now, one way of handling this ambiguity is by means of what's often referred to as an efference copy mechanism, whereby as you act, you route a message round to the sort of sensory part of your processing machinery that, in a sense, is a message that says, forget what you're about to experience, that's just a consequence of what you just did. Now, that can be done in very simple and peripheral ways in some animals. So even nematodes with only 300 neurons devote some neurons to sending these copies around. Or it can be part of a more integrated handling of sensing and action. So Merker himself sees an integrated handling of this ambiguity involving self and other relationships as characteristic just of vertebrates. Since then, Colin Klein and Andrew Barron have argued that some insects handle the problem in the same kind of centralized way. Now, so some of what's important in this set of ideas involves the notion of integration as a marker of a kind of complexity that's relevant to subjectivity. But also I think of it as showing a change in what you might call the shape of sensing. It features the internalization of a distinction between self and other. So animals that have machinery of this kind don't just encounter the world, they encounter the world as the world. And I think of this as a significant element in the creation of a point of view for the animal in a strong sense of the term. Now, I said early in this talk that I think the eventual shape of a theory in this area will include a very broad notion of subjective experience, feeling or sentience, and narrower categories that you might think of as marking out something like consciousness. But I also said that it's possible that some of what you might think of as features of consciousness in a rich sense may be parts of the story early on. So the combination of old and new features might not map onto what seem intuitively like a distinction between simple and more complex. And the idea of an early transition in the shape of sensing in which animals acquire, at least implicitly, a more definite sense of self and the self-other distinction, I think of as a possibility of that kind. Okay, let's now change gear completely and just start again thinking about what might be a plausible, very early and basic kind of subjective experience and something that we could tell an evolutionary story about. Well, there's been literature for a while now that tries to give a story of this kind that starts out from feelings that animals have which are essentially evaluative rather than essentially representational with respect to what's going on in the world outside. So Derek Denton coined the useful phrase, the primordial emotions. So the primordial emotions are feelings that animals like us have that mark important deficiencies in states such as thirst or not being able to breathe that have a kind of homeostatic character, and which Denton and also some other authors here conjecture might be plausible candidates for being the very first kinds of subjective experience. Now, this seems like, in some ways, a plausible view, and the very next thought I want to introduce is the idea that it seems you could have a lot of this going on, a kind of richness on the evaluative side, in an organism that was quite rudimentary or unsophisticated on the perceptual side. So suppose it was the case that it was an important and relevant distinction for questions about subjectivity that involves the divide between simple and complex forms of perceptual representation or sensing. Then it seems there could be an organism that was rich on this second side, the affective side, while being very rudimentary on the perceptual side. It could be affectively rich, but not in a way that involves sophisticated referral of events to environmental objects. So an organism might not have a very good sense of what exactly is going on, while having a strong sense or a stronger sense of whether what is going on is welcome or unwelcome. The evaluative side could be where the structure is. I'll come back to that thought in a moment, but I want to first sort of press the same kind of challenge involving strongly gradualist possibilities with respect to this second side. So suppose someone says, right, I agree with people like Denton and Jablonka that a plausible, most primitive kind of experiencing is essentially evaluative rather than essentially world-directed and perceptual. Then you again face the problem that this feature goes back very far in time and goes in some form or other to sort of unexpected places on the tree of life. Even bacteria make distinctions between welcome and unwelcome events, or unwelcome chemicals at least, and produce adaptive responses to them. You might say once again, right, we're just being told you have to have a strongly gradualist picture of the evolution of subjective experience and not one that's restricted to animals. You might say that, or you might look for something more like a sort of crucial threshold, and perhaps an animal-specific feature that can be used to mark a distinction between evaluation of a kind of more rudimentary kind that does not bring with it genuine feeling, and evaluation of a more sophisticated kind. And one reasonable candidate, I think a good one at least to talk about in this connection, is instrumental learning, where some animals, and certainly just animals, are able to learn by attending to the good and bad consequences of their actions. They're able to make the distinction between welcome and unwelcome events relevant to the rewiring or reconfiguration of their behaviour. Now, the evolution of this kind of learning essentially by reward and punishment, learning what works and doesn't work, has interesting differences from the apparent evolutionary shape of various other kinds of learning in animals. Classical conditioning, the kind of conditioning that is essentially predictive, the Pavlov's dog kind, where you learn that when I see X, I expect to see Y, is extremely common in animals. Nearly all bilaterian animals have it, and there's even one report of classical conditioning in an anemone. Recently, just last year, to my enormous surprise, a first credible-looking report of classical conditioning in a plant was published by Monica Gagliano and her group in Western Australia. So learning of a kind that's essentially predictive, when I see X, I expect to see Y, appears to be sort of no big deal mechanistically and very common. Learning in a way that essentially involves valuation appears to be different. It seems to be rarer in the tree of animal life, certainly confined to animals as far as anyone knows, and scattered through the tree in a way that makes it look like it may have evolved a number of times separately. So it's seen in vertebrates like us, it's seen in some mollusks, cephalopods pass all these tests, and also gastropods, and some arthropods. So some insects, especially bees, are very good at it, but in other insects it's not been seen. Now, when I say all these things, I'm relying very much on a review by Perry, Barron and Cheng on the top of the slide there, and it's important that that's a review of what has been found to be present. It doesn't make strong claims about what is shown to be absent in a particular kind of animal, and making those claims is much, much harder than showing something to be present. But the review does list instrumental learning, or learning in a way that essentially involves valuation, as absent, as unreported at least, in an interesting range of groups, including some well-studied groups. And those include wasps, which are insects, spiders, animals like millipedes within the arthropods, and starfish and some others. So you have a kind of scattered location of this kind of valuation-based learning in the tree. Okay, evaluative feelings of this kind are one plausible early form of subjective experience. Perceptual states of various kinds, I think, are another plausible early form. Both have often been used in single-factor theories. People say, this is the transition between conscious and unconscious animals, something about representation or something about feelings. But the two features obviously, and this is my emphasis, might come apart. The presence of one does not imply the other, and they might each have their own role in evolution. It seems possible, in principle, to have a rich form of evaluation present in an animal that's quite unsophisticated on the sensory side. The other separation seems possible as well. There could apparently be an animal that tracked the world with its senses in acute and complex ways, handling the self-other divide in a sophisticated, internally driven manner, but was much simpler on the evaluative side, an animal that's sort of more robotic in this sense. Now, in vertebrates, we have both sides. We have sophisticated sensing and we have evaluative feelings, and we can use them to learn. The same is seen in octopuses. There's complex valuation, and they have sophisticated sensing with those class 4, very high-tech eyes. But other cases might probe the relationship between the two. In particular, some land-dwelling arthropods might be examples of perceptually complex animals with much simpler evaluation. Now, all the cases are uncertain. I'm not going to put a slide up now of the case I'll talk about for a minute or so, because that case is spiders. And like many people, I am unfriendly towards spiders. Instead, I'll put up a picture of some charming nudibranchs in Fiji. So imagine a spider if you like, or just look at the nudibranchs. Now, in the review of invertebrate learning I mentioned, spiders are conspicuously absent from the list of instrumental learners. Sometimes one kind of spider, the jumping spiders in Australia, are described as instrumental learners, but I think they're not really a genuine case, or at least at best a borderline case. I could talk about that in the Q&A if people would like. Wasps are also listed as classical learners. They can learn predictively, but not so far as reported in a way driven by valuation, by reward and punishment. Now, the category wasp does not pick out a definite branch of the animal part of the tree of life, because ants and bees are embedded within a bunch of animals that are, sort of have a wasp-like appearance and a wasp-like lifestyle. So those sorts of cases, terrestrial arthropods, give us a sense of what to look for, and if arthropods of this kind had very simple evaluative capacities, that would make ecological sense. So terrestrial arthropods like wasps often have short lives dominated by routine, by a series of behaviours that have to be performed in the right order. There's not much openness in their lives. But these animals can face very sophisticated, very substantial demands with respect to sensing and motion, especially the animals in this group that can fly. I had a discussion with Rick Prum just before this talk about the way that bees are an exception among terrestrial arthropods, because they're extremely good evaluators. They can learn by instrumental conditioning in quite sophisticated ways. And Rick suggested that they are evaluators of flowers in a way that goes beyond just assessing whether a flower is sort of suitable or unsuitable as a place to land and look for food, and that might be the origin of the kind of particular and rare evaluative richness in bees. An interesting idea. Now, what about the other side? And now we can talk about our charming Fijian nudibranchs. In the review I cited, the least mobile animals that have been reported to engage in instrumental learning are gastropods, essentially slugs and snails. Now, what's been found in gastropods, to my knowledge, is very simple kinds of instrumental learning, nothing very fancy. But the divide seems possible there. They have simple eyes. Some of them have class 3 eyes, sort of low resolution image-forming eyes. And very simple ways of moving. They can't fly a comical image in the way that arthropods can. So they may be simpler on the sensory side and stronger on the evaluative side. So there are two traits here, or two clusters of traits, that each have plausible connections to subjective experience. But they don't look like different paths to the same thing. They look like paths to different things. Both of them can be summarised with the idea that there's something it's like to be one of these animals, but the evaluative and the perceptual forms of the something it's like seem to be quite different. And in evolution, animals might gain both features, or either one first and then the other, or both together, or they might gain one and then stop if they don't need it, or if it's precluded for some reason. In thinking about the evolutionary possibilities, you might wonder, okay, are all those paths equally plausible in principle? I mean, very speculatively, I would suggest that the evaluation only and the evaluation first, complex perception second paths might be less straightforward, because you might argue that animals need to have fairly complex behavioural capacities in order for complex evaluation to do them that much good. And if they have to have complex behavioural capacities, they might need fairly complex sensing as well. So you might regard that path as at least a little bit more questionable than the very straightforward path, I think, seen in animals like wasps, where you have a life so simple that complex evaluation has little role, but behavioural demand so substantial that complex forms of representation do have a plausible role. Okay, let me just keep an eye on the time. I lost a bit of time due to the crashing of the computer. Will I take 5 more minutes given that? Is that all right? Okay, yeah. Okay. Let me just now introduce, this is almost the last point. This is something, I was just reading a paper about this yesterday, and I've added it to the talk because it's so thought-provoking. So the picture I've given so far is that there's two kinds of paths, a kind of evaluative path and the sort of sensory representation path. And each has a kind of a gradualist possibility. You know, this goes right back down, and a more transition-based view, the idea that handling self-other is a transition on the sensory path, and something like instrumental learning is a crucial transition on the affective path. Are there kind of interesting cross-links between the two paths? I read a paper yesterday by Bjorn Brems, who's a learning theorist, and he starts out, he argues for a somewhat unorthodox view of the relationship between different kinds of learning in animals. And he starts out by making the point that a feature of operant conditioning or instrumental learning by reward and punishment, that's often not remarked on, is a role in that learning for the same kind of registration of self and other that I discussed on the other side of the story, on the more sensory side of the story. I mean, instrumental learning is learning the consequences of what you did. You know, it's not just learning whether events are going well or badly, but learning whether what you just did had good consequences or bad consequences. Difference making of some sort is essential to all learning of this kind. And in the case of instrumental learning as opposed to classical conditioning, the Pavlov's dog kind, you have to have some kind of registration of self-other distinctions in order to do the difference making that's essential to that kind of learning. Here I'm fleshing out slightly the argument that Brems makes, but that's essentially what he's suggesting. So that would suggest that there might be a common element on the sensory path and on the evaluative path that involves the internalization of a distinction between self and other, and that might be a transition with particular importance to subjectivity. And as I said earlier, this is one of those cases where a sense of self and other might be seen as not characteristic of feeling in the broad sense, but as something more refined and a sort of late-coming feature that you might associate with consciousness. But these reflections on the nature of sensing in a world in which everything you do affects what you sense, and also learning in a world where you've got to work out the consequences of what you did, not just the consequences of what's going on, there might be a role for the internalization of a self-other divide quite early in the story. Okay, as I say, that's a new thought for me, and I'm not sure exactly where that leads. All right, I'm going to finish the talk with a reference to an entirely different part of philosophy. This is a remark about the history of American pragmatism around the very early 20th century. Cheryl Mezak, in her book about pragmatism, quotes a discussion where some people were being critical of the pragmatist theory of truth as it was defended at that time. where for various reasons a crucial sort of question to ask was, are there meaningful questions that we can be quite sure we'll never be able to answer? Does that make sense? A meaningful question which we can be quite sure we will never be able to answer. And one of the guys who was party to this debate cast around for a question he thought was completely meaningful, but of a kind such that no experiment, no observation, no scientific work could ever help us with that question. And the example he chose was the following. He asked, suppose a person was to ask the question whether a particular ichthyosaurus who perished countless eons before the birth of the first man, suppose a person was to ask whether that animal felt pain as it died. And he used this as a kind of rhetorical move in this debate about the relationship between meaningfulness and testing. It's an interesting fact that in philosophy, claims of the form "we'll never be able to know whether such and such" have a remarkably bad track record in general. And I think of this as one within that family. I think that although we can't yet look at this animal and answer that question, I think that we're starting to build, sort of put steps in place towards a situation where you could, some years from now, by means of knowledge of the tree of life and the history of nervous systems, by means of inferences about the likely structures that were in place in ichthyosauruses and similar animals, and by means of inferences based on the way the body appeared as it died and was left in a fossil form, I think we will eventually be able to answer, I think, exactly the question that in 1901 was thought to be forever unanswerable. Yeah, I'll do that. Sure.
You can pick, but I'll...
Oh, okay. Actually, why don't you pick?
Okay, that's fine.
So, really cool talk. I'm wondering, comparing this stuff to some of the human research on consciousness, it seems like things like instrumental conditioning... it seems like things like instrumental conditioning have been shown to be possible unconsciously in humans. So I was wondering if you could comment on, that as how that relates to this theory that you think things like instrumental learning are so essential to consciousness in evolution of animals.
Learning of a kind, so situations where you don't know what association you've acquired, acquiring aversion to a food but not realizing that you've acquired
Right, like
it,
these things subliminally, it seems like, can be learned in humans.
I agree. That is a question. In general, in thinking about the relationship between the animal case, the non-human case, and the human case here, there's a question of how readily to draw inferences from what's conscious in people to what might be conscious in animals. A case I'll just briefly would have liked to have had a place for this in the talk, but it's so interesting I think it's worth just inserting at this point. In the case of classical conditioning in humans, there's a finding that if there's a decent delay between the... so if you're learning that X predicts Y, essentially, if X and Y are right next to each other, you can learn that association without knowing that you've learned it, without being conscious of it at all. But if there's a decent delay between X and Y, then you can only learn that X predicts Y if you know you've learnt it and can, it's a consciously acquired association. So Colin Allen in particular sees this as showing something really important about the distinction between conscious and unconscious learning. And some animals, such as rabbits, can do that delay-based learning. Other animals can't. It's a very interesting sort of way of probing at the distinction between conscious and unconscious learning. Now, in the case of instrumental learning, right, I take the point that it would be nice if this was a feature that in humans was very simply associated with the presence of subjective experience, such that you always knew if you'd learnt an association if it was an instrumental kind of learning. And I don't claim that that's the case. A general part of the framework I bring to bear here is the following. So I think that the particular kind of subjective experience that humans have is such that it may have transformed the role of various older and earlier traits, such that it would be sort of not reliable to infer from the most sort of directly observable, straightforward, report versus non-report kind of consciousness in humans, to whether that thing feels like anything at all in a non-human animal. Now, once you make that move, I agree, it makes it hard then to find, it makes the evidential lines in this area harder to track. So, okay, how do we make the distinction between what would count as, what's likely to be a form of cognition that is or is not subjectively experienced if we can't simply make the inference from that presence or absence in humans? And I accept that. So I agree that what you raise is a complication for the story, and it would be a variety of other kinds of evidence that would make us think, no, it really is the case that this is a genuine internalization of evaluation, and it's a plausible early form of subjective experience.
On the very first slide, the very top line gave me pause. Subjective experience, because at first it seemed redundant. And then I wondered whether it implied the possibility of objective experience.
Right.
Where you have no subject, and in which case you sort of have two continuums. One would be the development of subjective experience as the subject developed. The other would be a declining objective awareness, where the objective experience gets masked or blotted out by subjective experience.
I think it is sort of redundant. I think the first thing you said is right. This is the term that is standard, and I'm okay with it because it's sort of saying the right thing twice. I think it's pointing at the right phenomenon, but doing it with, in a sense, two words rather than one. I think that on some views in philosophy in particular, there could be such a thing as non-subjective experience, not in the same sense that you were describing, but in a different sense. So some people respond to this, the intractabilities of these questions by saying, well, maybe there's a kind of sensation-like feature present in all of everything, all of reality. It's a kind of panpsychist view. It's just that those sort of quasi-sensation-like features of reality are not yet collected into subjects until evolution has produced living things and then animals. So then subjectivity would come after the sort of experienceable, in a sense. It has to be collected together into subjects. Now, I think of this as a sort of picturesque but probably crazy option, I must say. And on that view, experience comes along and then subjectivity kind of collects it into certain kinds of units. And it's a helpful thing to have in the discussion in some ways, because I think of it, right, that's exactly the wrong way to think about the problem. The right way to think about the problem is to think that, once you understand, experience came into the world when subjects came into the world. And experience is just a kind of thing that's going on in subjects. And it's the way being a subject feels to that subject. And all the views that point away from that picture, such as the idea that qualia are a kind of object-like things to which subjects might be related, all the views that point away from what I just said, I think of as the wrong terms. The term subjective experience, in a way, points in the wrong direction because it makes it sound like there could be another kind, as you said. And I think the first thing you said is right. It is a kind of redundant phrase.
Hi, thanks very much. It's a very thought-provoking talk. Piaget, sort of, as he was trying to come up with a notion of the child's experience of reality, one of his early stages, he talked about sort of recursive sensomotor schema where the child realizes that things they do make things, that motor things they do, however that's experienced by the child, make sensory things happen in the world, and that has all sorts of recursive aspects to it. And he talks about the building up of sensory motor schema as kind of almost proto-concepts of the self in relation to the world. One of the flirtations that Piaget had in his youth was with psychoanalysis, and he was interested in the question of, could there be unconscious schema so that there might be very elaborate representations of the self interacting with the world of which there was no consciousness. And I guess also as an analyst, I'm interested in that question too, of how much the complexity of these schemas necessarily bears any relationship to the explicit consciousness of whatever that might mean.
I think it's, in some ways, your point raises an even bigger question, which is what's the relationship between the evolutionary history of experience and the history within the lifetime of any individual, the ontogenetic history. And I hadn't actually thought about this, but it seems obvious once one raises it. So, right, if acquiring a sense of self and other that conditions the way one deals with sensory input is a big deal in evolutionary time, is it a big deal also in ontogenetic time, in the lifetime of the individual? And I don't know what to say next to that. It's a very interesting thought. I mean, I don't think there are obvious arguments, obvious conclusions that follow. So, a human brain, a human nervous system has so much going on that, and so much that probably includes a role for reafference compensation well before the kid has any kind of unified sort of personal sense of that. That if you're thinking of this as a story about the origin of a sort of a sense-derived basic form of feeling, then there needn't be a simple mapping between the ontogenetic sequence and the evolutionary history. But as I say this, I'm just sort of feeling around. I think it's a very interesting question.
What about the unconscious part?
I have to admit, I got so caught up in the first part of your question that I don't have a good response to the last part. I was just thinking, oh, right, I've got to think about the ontogeny, and that's where I ended up. Yeah.
Just a quick follow-up on this, the subjective experience thing. I mean, there's that discussion in Chapter 2 of Strawson's Individuals about feature-placing languages, like it's hot, cold. Like, it's conceptually possible to, so Strawson in Chapter 2 is trying to say, what's the minimal condition? He's trying to, like, argue that you could just have a creature that hears sounds and still make a self-other distinction. But he starts with a feature-placing language, a creature that just hot, cold, but right. There's no subject. It doesn't make, so it seems like there is, I think this is the objective experience, just conceptually it seems possible to envisage this. I mean, I'm not sure if you're making a claim about, when you said it's redundant, subjective experience. It seems possible to imagine a creature that just hot, cold, red, blue, but doesn't have a self-other.
There's a question of whether that's, so that, just a small thing, because I don't think, so the version of objective experience that I was describing and opposing, I don't think of as that. Because I think what is being described there is a situation where there is a kind of subject, but they have no tracking of the fact that they are a subject. They don't refer events to self or world. And when I start thinking about this problem, I, perhaps like Strawson, think, right, this is a natural place to start. So just washes of a qualitative feel to stuff going on. Then I think to myself, all right, there's a name for organisms that sort of behave like that, and the name is bacteria. I mean, it's not as if this is there are ways of engaging with the world that have roughly that shape, which we normally presume do not involve any subjective experience, but do have that shape. And one response to that is to think, all right, we're going to have to rethink all these questions about sort of where this property stops with respect to where it is in the tree. On the question of the reliability of thought experiments of that kind, so suppose someone, you or Strawson say, look, I can just imagine a sort of wave of quality coming in, which is genuinely a case of phenomenal consciousness, but with no referral of this thing to environmental objects. It's sort of very simple on the sensory side, and no evaluation. It's got no evaluative side either. A person might say, I can just imagine that. And I'm not sure exactly how to push back on the imagining, but that's certainly my inclination. It's to think that, well, once you're living a certain kind of life in which most of your experience has a certain kind of complexity, both representational and evaluative, then there is such a thing as the kind of Rothko experience where you've just got the sort of wash of red or something. That is part of life, a very special part of life, and one shouldn't think that if you're a very simple organism just on the sort of edge of sentience, that a sort of Rothko-y form of experience is a plausible candidate for what it's like to be that guy. And I feel that that's driving some of the thought experiment here.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic. I'm actually sympathetic to you. But now this end with one question. Years ago, you said to me, I think it's absurd to say that like very simple creatures have propositional thought. But now it seems to me you're saying like, it's hard to imagine an experience without someone self-attributing that experience to themselves, which sounds like predication. And
I didn't mean to say that, but I can see what you're saying. I didn't mean as strong as that. I meant that if you're right, if I meant... and it's easier appealing to... I agree with you now. I agree predication is very basic and that's why the very experience of very little experience can come with predicational structure and self-attribution, which is... This is the last ally I want, this view. Not you, but this view. This is the last friend. Let me think about that. Yeah, I see the force of what you're saying. Oh. Yeah.
No.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, there you go. I've been trying to sharpen this question in my mind a little bit, just so we don't have to go down the road of asking you everything you've been thinking recently about gradualism. But it seems that you've brought together in talking about the evolutionary tree and sort of all these references to complex behavior. There are two certain, perhaps, levels of what I might call like scientific rigor here. So in terms of the tree, what made the evolutionary tree so substantive and so powerful in the 20th century was the genetic revolution. I mean, not just the fact that you're doing understanding morphology to construct the tree, but now you can actually get the DNA sequence. And I'm not so up to date on my latest behavioral animal research, but it seems that there's no clear equivalent for that. There haven't been those same kinds of strides, perhaps, in terms of thinking about complexity behavior and how you group certain types of animal versus bacteria versus archaeal behavior together, for instance. And I know there's a little bit of work on perhaps genetic modification in terms of colony behavior in wasps, for instance. I know there's a little bit of that going on at Princeton. But I'm wondering if, what are the prospects for scientific rigor in the sense of like a genetic revolution that went on to make the tree so powerful in terms of groupings of animal psychology and animal behavior together, and what potential philosophical implications are there for how far you can push that in terms of actually making sense of the gradualist question this question of how far back. Can we answer whether the gradualist theory of consciousness could actually be true or not?
Okay, that last point is the hardest one, so I'll come to that at the end. But let me just tackle some of the easier things first. So, first thing, so I think the tree has its power even, independently of genetics or anything like that. And I think it's an incredibly important structuring device in thinking about the evolution of experience. And outside of biology, in philosophy and many other places, people still often think of a scale. They say, where on the scale in animal life does consciousness come in? So that suggests that the lights turn on at a certain point, and everyone downstream in some sense or above that point has it. And it's completely the wrong way to think, because there is no scale. There's just the tree, and there are different kinds of complexity that are situated in different places on the tree. And I think quite a bit of work is done just getting there and getting away from scale talk in thinking about this problem. So so I think that even if we were more ignorant of the exact structure of the tree, even if we weren't sure that that crabs were closer to bees than they are to spiders or something like that, because that hadn't been worked out, the tree is an important guiding device here, I think. Now, the next part of your question, I agree with very much. It would be really good if there was a kind of framework with comparable kind of rigor as an organizing device that could be applied to cognition. Now, one reason I talked a bit about learning in this talk is the fact that learning theory is the place where there's been perhaps the most. That's where there's at least on the table a fairly standard list of kinds of learning, and there's an interesting kind of nested structure which appears on the face of it. So, for example, there's a class of animals that can do habituation. Within that class, there's a subset who can do classical conditioning. Within that set, there's a subset who can do instrumental learning, and no one can do instrumental learning but not classical conditioning. And that's a kind of nice piece of structure, it seems. It's a kind of organizing device. Now, one reason why I was so interested in the paper by Bjorn Brems that I talked about at the very end there is Brems wants to turn this whole thing upside down. He thinks this is a total mistake. He thinks that you should think of operant behavior driven by consequences, as the more basic thing. And he thinks that classical conditioning is what you observe in certain situations as a kind of isolable outcome of a whole bunch of other stuff more poorly understood. And when he says that, I throw my hands up, in both interest and in sort of horror, because the arguments are very interesting, but it's a kind of destabilizing of the one piece in this area that looks like a very kind of neat piece of structure. All these guys can do this, of those some can do that, there's no one who can do this without this, and so on. And this is partly why I made a big deal of learning, because there's some aspect here of looking for your car keys under the street light, because learning theory is a very good street light. Now, on the last thing that you said, how could we ever deal with the question of, we could call ultra-gradualism the idea that the properties of animal life relevant to subjective experience, demonstrably from looking at the sort of top of the tree, where top here means present, and in certain animals, those properties run in gradual form down and out and all through the tree of not just animals but other living things, in a way that suggests that we should completely remodel our thinking about subjectivity and regard it as a sort of, not a gradient because it's multidimensional, but something a little bit much more gradualist than the kind of binary on-off story. How could we work that out? How could we work out whether it is absolutely not true that bacteria have any of this property, or whether the right view is that they have a tiny, tiny, half of 1% or something? This is as far as I've got with that. I don't know how to go any further with it. I imagine that that's also a question. Eventually we'll find lots of lines of evidence bearing on it, and we'll find, this is answerable. just as the ichthyosaurus thing seemed utterly unanswerable at a certain point and now seems more tractable. But that's sort of all I can say, and it might just be an expression of temperamental optimism to some extent. Yes.
Okay. So I like a lot how you approach the problem, namely using ideas about sensory information processing, reference, and so on. But I find myself sort of waiting for the next logical step, at least the one how I would see it, and it didn't come. So let me try whether you would agree that it's the next logical step. So if you talk about operant conditioning and animals learning, how to deal with the environment, you could say, well, they acquire some models of how the environment works, right? A model of what a flower is, a model of how wind works, of how water works, and so on, right? So they have sort of different ways of if you want, representations of parts of the world that they are interacting with. Okay, if we can agree on that, then I think the next logical step would be consciousness enters the picture if the animal and when the animal starts making a model of itself, and then has subjective experience when the point is how environment interactions changes the model of itself, right? So we have a model of the world, we have a model of ourselves, not only an experience or whatever, but actually a sort of formally a structured implicit knowledge of what I am, right? I mean, I have a picture of, my temperamental inclinations, my talents and whatever, what I can expect myself being able to do, right? And it is sort of this internalization of making models of reality that could be the place to enter subjective experience. I don't know whether that makes sense to you.
The place or a place? So I see what you're sketching as a version of the first path, the kind of representation heavy rather than affect heavy path, where right. So suppose you believe the first path was an important path, and you're looking for transitions that make a difference. One such transition might be sort of the ability to refer events to external objects, and a second such transition might be constructing a minimal model of how things in the world work. A third step might be having a model where you're part of your own model. The idea that that's a sort of important path here, I take seriously. Maybe I'm sort of imputing things to you that were not intended, but I sort of heard, the way I took the question was, this is the path. And then I would push back in the following way. I'd think, okay, to think that is to think the following. It's to think that there could not be a form of evaluation, a kind of affect-driven set of evolutionary events that were sufficient for a kind of subjectivity, a kind of, it feels like something to be me of their own. So the talk is in some ways driven by the idea of separability between a kind of subjectivity that involves handling objects and increasingly sophisticated representational capacities, and a kind that involves evaluation with or without a model of the world. Now, Brems argues that the internalization of a self-other distinction is a kind of common element across a path that involves learning and a path that involves handling sensory information. And that as I say, I think is a very interesting idea. Right, so I guess one response I would make is to ask, why think this is the only way? Why think it's not just one way? Perhaps it is just one way. Okay.
So my question is pretty simple. To what degree does our subjective experience as humans influence the way that we understand subjective experience in general? And can we in a way, kind of over-specify what counts as experience and intelligence? And in what ways or to what degree do octopi or octopus, however you say it, experience themselves as we experience ourselves? And does this just manifest itself in a different way?
Right. I'll focus particularly on the first part, which I take to be the basis of a possible criticism, which is the question, to what extent is all our thinking about this stuff too conditioned by our own case? And how could we get outside the peculiarities of our own case and ask the question more broadly? I agree this is a big thing, and octopuses are a very helpful animal here. So, here's a way to make the... Suppose you think, and there were arguments of roughly this shape in the talk, suppose you think that getting a sense of self versus other is a very big deal in the transitions that are relevant to subjectivity. Then you have to deal with, and you might think that in part because in the human case, that seems a very natural way to approach the problem. I mean, humans are very sort of self-other attuned creatures. In the case of an octopus, with a far more distributed nervous system and some degree of apparent autonomy of action in each of the arms, right, the objection would be, look, these guys, they have all sorts of apparent marks of it feeling like something to be an octopus, but one thing they're probably not strong on is this sense of self thing. It's probably the last thing that they're probably sophisticated on in other respects and not in that respect. For example, they might be effectively quite rich animals. They have complex responses to damage and things like that, which might be good evidence for, or at least the basis for an argument that there's something it feels like to be an octopus, but self versus other is not their strong suit, perhaps. So I agree. I think that's an important challenge.
Right. So please join us in thanking Professor Godfrey-Smith for his talk.